This is not a political video. This is not a culture war video. And this is not a video about hate. This is a video about pressure, responsibility, obedience, and what happens when individual choice collides with systems that don't bend. This is the Order and Chaos Show. I am your host, Ron Bell, and this is episode 5, entitled Deadwood, the Renee Good Theory, when pressure exceeds containment. Now, no matter how emotional the story becomes, reality still operates by rules. Every human life operates inside systems of containment. Family, law, responsibility, restraint. Pressure exists everywhere. Financial pressure, moral pressure, ideological pressure, emotional pressure. But pressure by itself doesn't cause catastrophe. Pressure exceeding containment does. When that happens, systems don't ask you how you feel. They respond. Now, a parent with dependent children chose to insert herself into a volatile, unlawful confrontation involving federal officers. She ignored lawful commands. She escalated movement. She continued to advance. And what followed was not random. It was the end of a sequence of decisions. Now, one of the officers involved, Jonathan Ross, is a retired veteran, or is a veteran with over a decade of service at the Department of Homeland Security and prior military service. For context, this wasn't Officer Ross's first vehicle-related encounter. In a prior arrest incident in June of 2025, Ross was injured when a suspect accelerated while he was leaning into the vehicle during an attempted arrest. He was dragged a significant distance before being knocked free from the vehicle. As a result, he suffered multiple injuries, including a deep laceration on his arm that required a tourniquet at the scene, extensive bleeding, and multiple cuts and abrasions to his knees, his elbow, and his face. He was transported to a hospital where he received dozens of stitches to treat his wounds. Now, that incident is documented in court records and contemporaneous reporting. Now, context doesn't decide outcomes, but it does shape perception under pressure. Now, that context matters, not to excuse outcomes, but to understand how threat perception, memory, and milliseconds shape human response. When escalation occurs, there is no luxury of a philosophical debate. There is only trajectory, timing, and survival. Now, Scripture is explicit about hierarchy and truth. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith. That's 1 Timothy 5:8. Responsibility comes before ideology, and cause never outranks care. In Proverbs 22:3, it tells us the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. Now, wisdom is not bravado. Wisdom is restraint. Now, these moments are not new. Psychology has studied them for decades. Stanley Milgram demonstrated how ordinary people commit extraordinary acts when authority, crowd pressure, and moral diffusion converge. Solomon Asch showed how individuals will deny their own perception just to remain aligned with a group. Philip Zimbardo, who is famous for the Stanford prison experiment, and he wrote about in his book, The Lucifer Effect, I want to say it was somewhere around 1972, somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s. But he showed how quickly roles override personal ethics when people believe that the system supports them. Now, none of these studies require evil people, only pressure without containment. Now, there's another layer that deserves scrutiny. In the modern information environment, death is often weaponized, not mourned, not treated with reverence, but repurposed. Tragedy becomes a platform. A human life becomes a symbol. Facts become secondary to narrative. Some deaths are amplified into movements. Others are flattened into caricatures. Context is selectively elevated or buried to serve a story. The contradiction is this: moral outrage is demanded, while moral responsibility is dismissed. Empathy is amplified, while restraint is rejected. Certainty is proclaimed, while truth is truncated. Using a person's death to advance an agenda is not compassion, it is exploitation. And we saw this in 2020 during the death of George Floyd, when it became a global catalyst for protest and reform after police officer Derek Chauvin was convicted and imprisoned. This case is frequently cited as a symbol of injustice and moral failure within policing. Now, in contrast, when federal officers or ICE agents are involved in use of force incidents, the narrative often collapses into villainy. Before investigations conclude, while lawful orders, escalation dynamics, and officer context receive very little attention. Good faith citizens, officers, and bystanders who act under pressure are often vilified wholesale, not evaluated individually. The point is not equivalence. The point is inconsistency. Truth requires context, and justice requires process. And I want to be clear about what I mean by justice here. I'm not talking about what gets branded as social justice, when justice is severed from truth, from restraint, from due process. It stops being justice at all. It becomes ideology. It becomes outcome-driven moral theater. It becomes something that feels righteous, but no longer answers to reality. And what we're seeing now over and over again is the Deadwood. Narratives built on selective facts, moral outrage without responsibility, certainty without investigation, virtue without restraint. Deadwood doesn't bear fruit. It doesn't grow. It doesn't nourish the forest. It accumulates. And accumulation always creates danger. In nature, Deadwood doesn't resolve itself. It either rots or it burns. Fire isn't cruelty. Fire is correction. It clears what is brittle, what is false, what can't support life anymore, so that something living can grow again. Scripture understood this long before we did. It states, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it may bear more fruit. That isn't punishment, that's pruning. That's restoration. Fire doesn't care about slogans. It doesn't care about hashtags. It doesn't respond to moral posturing. Fire tests substance. Ideas that cannot survive truth, context, and process reveal themselves. They are the deadwood, and deadwood always burns. Not because we hate justice, but because we refuse to counterfeit it. When justice is detached from truth, process, and due restraint, it stops being justice altogether. It's power wearing a moral mask. Your causes do not outrank your children, ever. Adulthood means understanding that you do not get to gamble with outcomes when other lives depend on you. Belief does not suspend consequence. Now, critical mass is not an ideology, it's an accumulation. One ignored command, one forward motion, one more step. Eventually, the system runs out of room to absorb it. Now, the real tragedy is not what happened in the street. The real tragedy is what happens next. For the children who had no vote in any of this. This is why responsibility matters. This is why restraint matters. This is why containment exists. Pressure reveals who we are. Accountability reveals what we choose. Now, if you like this content, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and I'll be sure to get back to you. See you next time.
Peace.
Peace. Hey, sweetie.